Well, we're going to be in Luke chapter 16, if you want to turn there. We're not talking about sexuality. Hallelujah. Yeah, that's probably one of the weirdest things that's ever been said in church, but that's the way we do it. That's the way we do it. We're talking about finances. Are you serious? Yeah, we are. Other hours. Whoever thought that was a good idea? Whew. Started out so great. Relationships, talking about the relationships in our lives. That makes up most of the other hours of our lives, the hours outside of church. Yeah, that's great. Our occupation. Yeah, let's figure out how we're supposed to be conducting ourselves at work and what is the work God has called us to do and all of that. It sounds so good. And then rest. Oh, that was a winner. Church attendance through the roof. I had people coming up and telling me, man, I'm so glad we had that message because my wife had a huge list of to-dos for me after church today and out the window. And even on Mother's Day, we talked about rest. And now it's Father's Day and we're talking about finances. And here we go. We're in our other hours. We believe God wants to make you good at life, not good at church. Church is definitely something I think that is helpful. It's been very helpful for me. I look at church as kind of that little table with some orange slices and maybe a little Gatorade and water cups. And we're here running our life, running the marathon of life. And church is just supposed to be this, what we're doing now, what we're doing in small groups, all these things. It's the thing that we kind of come and we're doing life, and then we just get this little bit of sustenance to help us keep running the life, running the race that God has called us to. Church like this is not what Christians are supposed to do. This is just supposed to be a help for us to do what we're supposed to do. Because what God is more interested in, I really believe more interested in what takes place outside these walls than what takes place inside. I'm not saying God doesn't care about what takes place inside these walls. I think He cares very much. But this place only represents such a small fraction of our life when we're gathered together in these places. And I'm so thankful that because of the worship team and the prayers that happen down below and during the week, and because of many of you and your ability to kind of press in and gain God's presence and perspective, that the space really does seem to be a little bit thin between heaven and earth in this place. It's just a little thinner. It's like, okay, heaven just feels closer. It's easier to access in this place or in small groups when you meet outside this place with other believers. That's perfect and wonderful. I'm not trying to diminish that at all, but I'm trying to increase our understanding that God cares very deeply for every aspect of your life, the other hours of your life. And so we've tried to break up other hours into 5 different quadrants, 5 different groups, and we did. We talked about relationship. We talked about occupation or work. We talked about rest. We talked about sexuality, and it was so fun. We loved it. All smiles. And now we're talking about finances. It's number 5. It's the grand finale. And interestingly enough, Jesus talked about finances more than anything else in His ministry here on earth. You know what number 2 is? Hell. It's kind of interesting because if you go to church long enough, it's not necessarily what you hear about. Some churches you hear about hell every Sunday. That wasn't the only thing Jesus talked about. But finances are a really big deal to God. In fact, at the end of our story today that we're going to read, Jesus says to them, you cannot serve 2 masters. If you try and serve 2 masters, you will end up hating one and loving the other. And then his final phrase is, you cannot serve God and money. God and money. He could have said God and a lot of other things. We have a lot of other gods in our lives, other things we give ourselves to inappropriately, idolatry. But Jesus chose to say, hey, for most of you, most of the time, you're going to be challenged between God and money. And he wasn't talking to America at that point. I know it's hard to believe that Jesus, wasn't American, but he wasn't, not even close. I can't even imagine what he would say to us if he walked around with us for a while. Now, Jesus was aware of the Roman Empire. He was not a Roman, but he was born into a Judeo situation that was under the authority of the Roman Empire. So he knew what Roman citizens were like. He knew that they were the world power. They had all of the provisions. To be a Roman citizen was basically like an elite status almost anywhere in the world. You had rights and privileges that nobody else did. I think it would probably compare somewhat to what it's like to be an American. And as we travel around this world, we see that we have many rights and privileges that are not accessible to everyone else. But Jesus was also speaking and coming from a perspective of true poverty. Not only was his family of origin extremely poor and oppressed, but he himself is described as someone that had no place to lay his head. He's kind of a wandering camper, wandering around the Sea of Galilee, camping on the shores and on the hillsides with his disciples, paying taxes by fish that he caught that had coins in them. So I want you to understand that Jesus is both aware of what it's like to be rich and what it's like to have nothing. Although many of us can't say the same thing. And money was a big deal. And you look through the whole of Scriptures, money is a huge topic. And what we have today, we're just going to start out. We're going to do 3 teachings on finances. And I just want to give us an intro that kind of blew my mind as I was preparing for this. And it just stuck with me. And it comes from Luke chapter 16. Luke chapter 16 is a parable that Jesus tells. We don't know exactly all the context because, again, Luke's kind of just recording stories. He's not necessarily recording one long narrative story. He's just kind of giving us glimpses into the life of Christ and his teaching and earthly ministry so that we'll get a full perspective. And actually, he isn't even writing for us. He's writing for a guy named Theophilus. But we get to listen in. So let's go ahead and read Luke chapter 16, and we're going to go 1 through 13, and then we're going to kind of unpack the story, see if we can glean some goodness from Jesus, the teacher. Chapter 16, verse 1. Jesus told his disciples, "There was a rich man whose manager was accused of wasting his possessions. So he called him in and asked him, 'What is this I hear about you? Give an account of your management, because you cannot be manager any longer.' The manager said to himself, 'What shall I do now? My master's taking away my job. I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I know what I'll do so that when I lose my job here, people will welcome me into their houses.' So he called in each one of his master's debtors. He asked the first, 'How much do you owe my master?' 900 gallons of oil," he replied. Maybe the master was a farmer of some sort and had a whole bunch of oil, and so if he is able to lend out 900 gallons of oil, and that way he probably had a lot of oil. This probably really was a rich man. And so he said, "Well, take your bill, sit down quickly, and cut it in half. Make it 450. Then he asked the second, 'And how much do you owe?' 1,000 bushels of wheat," he replied. Again, that's a lot. He told, "Take your bill and make it 800. The master then called in his manager, his dishonest manager, and he commended him because he had acted shrewdly. For the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so that when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. Whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much. And whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much. So if you have not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches? And if you have not been trustworthy with someone else's property, who will give you property of your own? No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. I got to go on a little camping trip this last weekend, and it was a lot of fun. We went to the Black River and hiked around and fished for a couple days and caught a bunch of fish, and it was just a nice time. It was a really good time. Saw a couple rattlesnakes, which was fun and invigorating. Swam in some very cold water, which was again fun and invigorating. And on the way out, we had our backpacks with all of our stuff, all of our fishing gear, everything, and we're hiking out, and I lost both fishing reels that I had brought in. I had a fly fishing reel, that was my brother Peter's, and I had a spinning rod fishing reel, that was my brother John's, and I had brought both of them in. It was very nice of them to let me borrow them and all of that, and we went in there, and I had a great time fishing with them. Everything was wonderful, and then we get to the top of the hill, and I was like, the zipper bag had come open, and both reels were gone. And to me, I thought, as the younger brother, well, at least I lost one of each, right? Just kind of keep it equitable between my brothers. And but as I talked to my brother and shared with him that I had lost his reel, he said, well, maybe you can get your own next time. And we all understand this simple principle of trust. Like you give your kids a little responsibility. If they prove themselves trustworthy, you give them more responsibility. And on and on and on and on it goes. And that's what Jesus is saying too, real simply. He's like, if you're trustworthy with little, you'll be trustworthy with much. If you're not trustworthy with little, you won't be trustworthy with much. If you can't handle something that's insignificant, I'm not going to give you something that is significant. If you can't take care of the rod and reel that I give you, I'm not going to give you another one or a better one. Very simple principles. We all understand. And yet it's very important for us to understand, because basically what Jesus is saying is the resource, wealth, position, finances that God has given you, He's paying attention to what you do with it. And for some of you, He's paying a lot more attention than you are. He's getting your bank statements at the end of each month. He's paying attention to it. Not because He wants to say, aha, you horrible person. Not because He's looking at it because He wants to make you feel guilty or wrong or make you feel like you can't ever do anything. Sometimes my wife has felt that in our relationship. Where she's like, I don't even know if I'm ever allowed to spend any money because I'm a little controlling or overbearing. Little. We've had to work on that. But that's not why God's doing this. God is actually checking your bank statements all the time. He's watching when no one else is watching because He wants to give you more. There's a difference here between like a scarcity mindset and a mindset of plenty. There's a difference here. Maybe your earthly father was always looking to try and catch you so he could take from you. But your Father in heaven, you've got to understand, He is watching you, He is studying you, He is searching everything you do all the time because He wants to give you more. He keeps giving you opportunity after opportunity after opportunity to show yourself trustworthy and faithful so that He can give you more. And that's what that other parable where Jesus is talking about when the master gave talents, 10 talents to one, 5 talents to one, and 1 talent to one. And we don't know the backstory of why He did that. We just come new to it, but it's probably because those people had shown themselves either trustworthy or not. But I love that he still gave one to the person that was probably not very good. Right? And then when the whole story plays out, they come back and the 10 now has 20 and the 5 now has 10. And the one buried it because he was scared of his master. He had a scarcity mindset. He thought the master was doing it to try and get him. And so he buried it. And when he brought it back, the master didn't commend him. The master actually kind of said, "Depart from me. You got no place here anymore. You don't understand who I am." And then the inequity seems to happen. And then he says, "And take what that person had and give it to the person with 10. And we all go, "That's not fair." God is not fair. He's never said he's going to be fair. He's just. He does what is right. And he doesn't care if you think it's fair or not. I mean, that is basically 48 hours of my 24-hour day at home with 5 kids. 3 of my own and 2 extra that belong to me. It's just all about, that's not fair. And I'm like, I don't care what's fair. Because I have a perspective you don't have. And the same thing is true with us. We don't have God's perspective. He has an eternal perspective. The best way to picture it is, like a parade. Here's this parade going across. And we're standing at the edge of the parade and we're watching it. And it's like, oh, here comes Snoopy or whatever, the float. Macy's Day, Thanksgiving. You with me now? So there's Snoopy flying across. And we see Snoopy, and then we can kind of barely see, SpongeBob. He's still over there. We got Snoopy, and then coming up over here, some sort of Japanese cartoon figure, anime, whatever. Sorry, I should know the name because I know some of you love it, but I don't. And we can see this perspective. But God is he's in a blimp up above, and he sees the beginning of the line, he sees the end of the line. He can see every float and everything that's going on, what's around every corner. He's got the perfect perspective. And what I'm hoping that this story will help us do is begin to trust God's perspective, try and gain God's perspective. And that's what Jesus is trying to teach here. So let's kind of unpack this as we go through. We're going to do some real Bible study here from the words of Jesus. Oh, there's nothing better. So it says in verse 1, Jesus told his disciples. So Jesus is actually talking. And when Jesus is talking, we need to listen. We need to pull up a little dirt, a little chair, whatever it is, sit and just tune in. Because Jesus has that perspective. Jesus cares about us. He knows everything. And he right here is trying to help you and I, help his disciples understand what money's all about, understand who the master, who the Father is, on what we will be getting account for, what the master's looking for, what he's going to commend, what he's not going to commend. This is a huge insight. And not only is this a huge insight, but basically this has been preserved for 2,000 years. Think about the journey that these words have taken to arrive here with us today. Jesus sat down with his disciples and spoke these words to them. Was Luke in that audience? No, he was not one of Jesus' disciples. He was a doctor that came around later, about probably 20 years after Jesus had been crucified. He came back into Jerusalem because he had heard so many stories through oral tradition about this guy Jesus and what he had done. And he had seen so many people in his community whose lives were radically changed. He'd seen the miracles. He'd seen the signs. He was so moved by this Jesus figure, and he was a doctor. So he's like, let me see what's true, And so he goes, that's the way doctors all talk. Let's see, that's interesting. But then he goes into the Jerusalem context there, and he interviews Mary, and he interviews Mary Magdalene, and he interviews all the other people that are around. He interviews the disciples that are still around. He interviews everybody. And he wrote his gospel probably around the 60, A.D., and he actually wrote after Mark was already in circulation. Mark is 16 chapters. Luke and Matthew wrote after him. They kind of include Mark, and then they add these other stories that needed to be added. And so Luke goes around and finds out what is true, what is verifiable. And that's what his account gives us. And so he'd heard this one story about Jesus teaching on finances. Maybe Luke was a wealthy guy, so it was interesting to him. So he records this in his book that he's writing to Theophilus. And then from there, this book is preserved and circulated around the Jewish Christian world. And then it's spread around into the Gentile Christian world of that time. It wasn't written in English. It was written in Greek. In Greek at this point, the Greek that this is an ancient language. It's something that's a dead language. Now there is still Greek speaking today, but it's different than that. It's just like Hebrew. But it's translated into these other languages on and on and on. At first, kind of the most general translation that the scriptures went into was Latin, because that was the most universal language at the time. And so we have Latin translations into English, but then we also thankfully have people who are super smart and I guess super bored with their life. No, I shouldn't say that. It's not true. I'm so thankful for these people. And they sit down with these words and they say, I'm not satisfied with the translation through Latin to English. I want to get straight to the source. And they've spent their entire lives trying to get back to understand what real Greek, what the ancient Greek really was like. And how the language felt, so then they can go straight from that into English, so that you and I would have a better chance of really getting the heart of what Jesus was saying. It's beautiful what has been done to bring these words to us. And what's so cool is there's people around this world that are trying to translate into the most far-reaching, bizarre languages, so that those people can also have access to what Jesus is saying to us. The author of life. The Alpha and the Omega, what he would say to us. And in this story, he's talking about finances. And secondly, he's talking to his disciples. He's talking to the people that actually want to be with him. At times, Jesus is talking to the crowd, and we have to interpret what Jesus is saying in that context with the crowd context. Sometimes he's talking to the Pharisees, and it's hard to read those things because he's just beating them up. But this one, he is actually talking to his disciples. Now, interestingly enough, we'll see at the end of this passage that the Pharisees respond to what he said. So even though he's talking to his disciples, you got a couple Pharisees like, listening in. Because they're trying to find some way that they can get rid of this guy. So a lot of times you'll see that where Jesus is talking to his disciples, and yet the Pharisees respond to it afterwards. Because they're sneaking into the group of disciples, trying to hear what Jesus has to say so that they can catch him. And what we see after the resurrection is some of those Pharisees who were trying to catch Jesus and trap him. They gave their life to Jesus because they couldn't deny him. His teaching and his life and his resurrection. So this is gold that we are about to read right through. And then he goes on and says, there was a rich man whose manager was accused of wasting his possessions. He was accused. Now, this is a story Jesus is telling, so we can't really get more details than this. You can't say, Jesus is just giving us all the details that matter. He's making it up. But he was accused of wasting his possessions. So he called him in and asked him, what is this I hear of you? Give an account of your management, because you cannot be manager any longer. So Jesus is calling to the master is calling to this manager saying, hey, come, you have to give an account because I've heard a rumor that you're not doing it right. And we've already mentioned this. Every single one of us will give an account. Jesus is checking our bank records for sure. And he sees through all of the pretending and justifications that we might put forward as good and valid. Because he actually knows what's good and valid. You can't play games with him. But more importantly than this is an allusion, as Jesus does many, many times in his parables, to something far greater than just what's happening in this life. He's actually taken us to what's next in the next life. And the scripture is very clear. Listen up. The scripture is very clear that every single person who has been given the breath of life will stand before God and give an account for what they have done with that breath, with that life. You and I are going to stand before God and give an account for what we have done. First and foremost, with Jesus, and then secondly, with whatever resource He has given us. Jesus makes it very, very clear. And that test is more important than any other test you could ever go through in this life. And the truth is, the tests you're going through right now are actually preparation for that test. Because that's going to be the end-all, be-all. Everyone will give an account. Jesus, once again, is consistently teaching that. The manager says to himself, "What shall I do? My master's taking away my job. I'm not strong enough to dig. I'm ashamed to beg. I don't know what I'll do so that when I lose my job here, people will welcome me into their houses then." And so he calls in and does this kind of thing that doesn't seem like you should be allowed to do that with your manager's stuff. Like, hey, you want a 900? Bam, 450 for you. Remember me, here's my card. You, 1,000 bushels? All right, 800 bushels. Bam, he's using his position, his resource to go ahead and make good with people so that when he loses his job, he can call them up and say, hey, you remember those bushels and those gallons? Because I sure do, you know? And then it goes through, and then the master commends the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. Dishonest and shrewdly. We think of the word shrewd, we think of dishonest. But the definition of the word shrewd, I actually wrote it down here, it's sharp powers of judgment. So there's a connotation that shrewdness is a negativity, which is funny. I had all my Belizean friends here, and I was asking them, we were kind of studying through this together, and I said, what do you think of the word shrewd? And one of them said, wise. I was like, really? Because someone's shrewd, I don't want to hang out with them at all. But that is a truer definition of the word shrewd. It's sharp powers of judgment. It's being able to see through things. And this guy was dishonest. Jesus isn't teaching us to be dishonest, but he's saying that you need to understand something about the master. You need to understand something about your Father in heaven. What's most important to him is that you use what you have in this life to build the next life. And I am totally okay with all of that taking place without death. Now, hear me out on this. There's two concepts of heaven. There's one is we are literally just here on earth awaiting for this day when we will step into another reality called heaven, the next life. And there is that reality. You can see that in scriptures. That there is a now and there is a next. But you can also have this thing you see in the scriptures where there is a now and there is a now. Remember, God is on the blimp. And basically, Jesus said the kingdom of heaven is here among you. And so there's this concept of the kingdom now. So it is true that some of this stuff plays out in our lives in this context, and it'll play out in our lives in the next context, that they all kind of work together because God is not limited to one context. You tracking with me there? Maybe that might be a second service point. I don't know. Just kidding. Just because it's, a little early for the morning for that deep stuff. But it is a little confusing, but it's only confusing because we're so limited in our finite perspective. And Jesus is trying to help us understand God's infinite perspective. But definitely the things that we do right now, the only moment you have any control of in your life is this one now. And what you do now will affect the moments to come. And it's interestingly here because Jesus actually says to him, "For the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so that when it is gone you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings." You see the phrasing of the word there. Jesus is trying to help his disciples. Hey guys, I'm not talking about real right now friends and homes. He drops the word eternal in them to help them understand, I'm talking about something much bigger than just being invited to the next party. I'm talking about things a lot bigger than just having someone to call when you have to move. Because they have a truck. And one time you were nice to them, and they have a truck, and they have a truck. But he drops this word eternal because he's trying to get his disciples to all of a sudden, oh wait, Jesus is talking about something beyond just this life. That the finances, the positions, the resources, whatever we have right now, Jesus is saying that a wise, shrewd manager of those things will learn from the people of this world, and they will use them as investments for what is to come in the next world or in the future. And so this whole teaching on finances, what I'm trying to help us understand is that you have been given finance. You're like, well, it's barely enough. Well, okay. Whatever you have been given, God is looking to you to use it wisely, to invest in the kingdom of heaven, to invest in His kingdom. And the resources that you have been given obviously are more than just monetary. In fact, this manager, he didn't have monetary possession. He had a position. He had a job. And he used that cunningly, wisely, to position himself better in what's to come. A couple conclusions for us here that I thought were so interesting. The master's main concern is not that the money was gained or lost. Remember, he didn't even talk to the manager about, well, where's my 450 gallons of oil? That wasn't his priority. His priority wasn't whether or not the manager actually was wasting his possessions or not, interestingly enough. The master commends the accused manager, who seems to have cheated him out of some money, for caring more about his future than his present. He sees wise investment practices in the manager who did not strive to maintain what he had. He didn't use all of his energy to maintain his position, but he used what he had to gain a hope-filled future. Don't try and maintain what you have. Work with what you have to secure your future. Use the wisdom, wealth, relationships, jobs you have in this life to build up your future in the next life, in the next generation, in the next season of your life. What you do in this season of your life, you've got to understand it's only temporary. And if what you do in this season will affect what you do in the next season, both in the natural and in the eternal perspective. In 1 John 2:15 and 17, it says, "Do not love the world or anything in the world. If anyone loves the world, love for the Father is not in them. The world and its desires pass away, but whoever does the will of God lives forever." There's a guy named C.T. Studd, and when you got the last name of Studd, you just every once in a while got to do a quote from him. This is a poem he wrote. It's much longer than this, but this is one little stanza. It says, "Only one life, the still small voice, bidding me selfish aims to leave. Only one life 'twill soon be past, and only what's done for Christ will last." And so as we begin this discussion, this teaching, this time of talking about finances, I want us to understand Jesus' perspective is that what you have, you shouldn't be spending all your time trying to maintain. But what you have been given, you should learn how to give it wisely, shrewdly, to set up yourself for the next season, you and your family, of life. And obviously Jesus is always more concerned with the eternal perspective. but it does play into the reality that the kingdom of heaven is among us now. And we're going to tell some stories along these lines. I'm very excited to share with you guys things that I've been able to see the Lord do. Mark's going to share some of his stories. He's got all kinds of crazy stories of what the Lord has done in this Living Streams perspective, in the Buckley perspective, and as he's watched other followers of Christ apply these principles. But I want us to, right now, just try and begin to pray and seek the Lord and for his perspective, his eternal perspective, his eternal wisdom on the situation that you have currently. Let's just take a little time now and we'll pray. We'll just allow the Spirit to maybe speak and highlight some things in our life. Just take a moment in the quiet and assess where you're at. Are you stressed? Are you accused like this manager? Have you lost, or are you in fear of losing something significant right now? And if that's the case, ask God what his eternal perspective, what you can do now, how you can see this as an opportunity to gain in his kingdom, what you could not gain without this opportunity. Try and assess whether you see God as someone who's taking account of you so he can bust you, or taking account of you so that he can promote you, as Jesus would teach us. Jesus, we thank you so much for your word that has been preserved and that teaches and guides us and leads us. We thank you so much that we get to spend time digging in deeper and deeper, and then we have your Spirit alongside us to guide us into all truth. And Lord, I do pray that we would get deep, that we would become excellent in how we handle finances in this church. Whether we have a lot or little, we would be great at building your kingdom in our own lives and in our families and in the generations to come, and most importantly, in the life to come. The everlasting life that you promised and that you made possible by your investment on the cross, by the price that you paid. Thank you, Jesus. We're going to have the ushers come and pass out the bread and the cup. You can just hang on to it and we'll all take it together once everyone's been served. And you can take this moment to just kind of talk to your Lord about where you're at as far as the sin in your life, the temptation in your life. Be honest with him. And then we'll all take it together. Jesus, we thank you so much that you care about every aspect of our lives. And Jesus, we just want to pause in this moment and thank you for the sacrifice you made so long ago that so greatly affected our future, that you knew what we needed even before we were asked. And you willingly laid down your life so that we could find life. And we do come with grateful hearts, and we remember your body that was broken to make us whole. Let's take the bread. And we remember that you allowed your blood to flow because you knew a price needed to be paid to wash us clean, to make us whole. And now, thanks to this blood, when your Father looks at us, he sees us as clean and righteous. We're so thankful, Jesus. Let's take the cup. Will you stand with me as we close in a chorus? And once again, just tune our hearts towards God.